The crackling radio transmission cut through the Afghan night like a knife. "Base, this is Viper 7. Tell my family I love them." The voice belonged to Sergeant Marcus Chen, and those would be his final words before the Taliban ambush claimed his life. But what the enemy didn't know was that Chen's death had just awakened something far more dangerous than any weapon in the American arsenal. They had awakened Captain Sarah "Ghost" Morrison, and she was about to become their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Morrison wasn't supposed to be in Afghanistan. At 28, she was already one of the Army's most decorated female snipers, with confirmed kills that made seasoned veterans take notice. Her call sign, Ghost, wasn't just about her ability to remain unseen. It was about how she seemed to vanish and reappear like a specter on the battlefield, always where the enemy least expected her. But Sarah was supposed to be on leave. After 3 consecutive deployments and a record that spoke for itself, Command had finally ordered her to take some time off. She was back home in Montana, trying to remember what normal life felt like, when the call came. The voice on the other end was Colonel James Whitfield, her commanding officer, and the man who had become something of a father figure to her over the years. "Sarah, I need you back," he said without preamble. "We've lost a team in the Hindu Kush. Good men, your men." Sarah had known Marcus Chen since basic training. They'd served together in Iraq, survived firefights that should have killed them both, and had developed the kind of bond that only exists between soldiers who faced death together. When she heard his name among the casualties, something inside her went cold and hard as steel. "How many?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. "All 6. Bravo Squad was conducting a reconnaissance mission when they were ambushed. Intel suggests it was a coordinated attack by a new Taliban cell operating in the region. These aren't your typical insurgents, Sarah. They're organized, well-equipped, and they knew exactly where our boys would be." The implication hung heavy in the air. Someone had leaked the mission details. Someone had sold out Bravo Squad, and now 6 of America's finest were coming home in boxes. "I want the mission!" Sarah said without hesitation. "Sarah, you're on leave. You need—" "I want the mission, Colonel! Chen was my spotter in Fallujah. Rodriguez saved my life in Kandahar. These men weren't just soldiers, they were my family, and family doesn't go unavenged." There was a long pause before Colonel Whitfield spoke again. "This isn't a standard mission, Captain. What I'm about to propose goes beyond normal rules of engagement. The enemy we're dealing with is different. They're brutal, they're smart, and they've made it personal by targeting our intelligence networks." "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to do what you do best. Disappear into the mountains, find the cell responsible, and eliminate them. All of them. No prisoners, no questions, no rules except the ones you make." Sarah understood. This wasn't going to be a by-the-book military operation. This was going to be a hunting expedition, and she was going to be the predator. The Taliban cell had made a mistake when they killed Chen and his team. They had just painted a target on themselves that only one person in the world was qualified to remove. "How long do I have?" "As long as it takes. You'll have full operational control, hand-picked support team, and access to any equipment you need. But Sarah," his voice grew serious, "once you cross that line, once you become what they'll need you to become out there, there's no going back. You understand what I'm asking of you?" Sarah looked out the window of her Montana cabin at the snow-covered peaks that reminded her so much of Afghanistan. Somewhere in those mountains, the men who had killed her brothers in arms were celebrating their victory. They thought they had struck a blow against the American military. What they didn't realize was that they had just signed their own death warrants. "I understand, Colonel.
When do I leave? Transport leaves from Malmstrom Air Force Base in 6 hours. Pack light. Everything else will be waiting for you at Bagram. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt the familiar calm that always settled over her before a mission. But this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. Marcus Chen's final words echoed in her mind. "Tell my family I love them!" She would carry that message, but first, she had a message of her own to deliver to the Taliban. The message was simple. Ghost was coming, and hell was coming with her. Sarah moved through her cabin with practiced efficiency, selecting only the essentials. Her custom rifle case, her father's military compass, and a photo of Bravo Squad taken during their last mission together. She paused at the photo, studying the faces of 6 men who had trusted the system to keep them safe, only to be betrayed by someone on the inside. As she prepared to leave for what would become the most dangerous mission of her career, Sarah Morrison had no idea that she was about to become a legend. In the weeks to come, Taliban fighters would whisper her name in the same breath as death itself. They would call her the Angel of Death, a ghost that haunted the mountains and claimed lives with supernatural precision. But that night, as she locked up her cabin and headed for the airbase, she was just a soldier going to war to avenge her fallen friends.
The transport plane's engines roared through the night as Sarah Morrison tried to catch some sleep during the 14-hour flight to Afghanistan. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus Chen's face, heard Rodriguez's laugh, remembered the way Thompson always hummed old country songs before a mission. These weren't just casualties to her. They were family, and family demanded justice. Bagram Airfield looked exactly as she remembered it, a sprawling military base carved out of the harsh Afghan landscape, surrounded by mountains that held secrets and enemies in equal measure. As the transport touched down, Sarah felt the familiar weight of deployments settling on her shoulders. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't part of a unit. She was a weapon, and Colonel Whitfield had just pointed her at the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos was waiting for her at the flight line. Santos was a legend in her own right, a former Delta Force operator who had transitioned to intelligence work after an IED had ended her field career. She walked with a slight limp, but her eyes were sharp as a razor, and Sarah knew immediately that this woman was someone she could trust. "Lieutenant Morrison, welcome back to paradise," Santos said with a grim smile. "I've been briefed on your mission. Unconventional doesn't begin to cover it." "What do we know about the cell that hit Bravo Squad?" Sarah asked as they climbed into a Humvee. "More than we'd like, and not nearly enough." Santos handed her a classified folder. The leader goes by the name Hakim El-Rashid, former Afghan National Army officer who went rogue after his village was accidentally bombed during a NATO operation 5 years ago. He's smart, well-trained, and has a network that includes former military personnel and foreign fighters. Sarah studied the intelligence photos as they drove across the base. Hakim El-Rashid looked like a man who had seen too much war and let it consume him. But it was the next photograph that made her blood run cold. "Is this the leak?" she asked, pointing to a picture of a man in American military uniform. Santos's expression darkened. Staff Sergeant David Pierce, communications specialist assigned to intelligence operations here at Bagram. "We've been watching him for 3 weeks now, ever since we started noticing patterns in Taliban attacks. He's been feeding information to al-Rashid's network in exchange for what we believe is a substantial sum of money. He sold out Bravo Squad?" The evidence strongly suggests it. Pierce had access to the mission briefings, knew the route, knew the timing. The ambush was too perfect to be luck. Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest. Bad enough that her friends had died in combat. That was the risk every soldier accepted. But to be betrayed by one of their own, sold out for money by someone who had sworn the same oath they had, that was unforgivable. "What's the plan for Pierce?" "That's not your concern," Santos said firmly. "Military justice will handle him. Your job is al-Rashid and his cell.
We've identified their base of operations, a compound in the Torrid Bora region, heavily fortified and nearly impossible to assault with conventional forces. Nearly impossible? Santos smiled. For conventional forces. But you're not conventional, are you, Captain? You're a ghost. They pulled up to a nondescript building on the far side of the base. Inside, Sarah found everything she could have asked for and more. Her custom Barrett M82A1 sniper rifle had been flown in from the States, along with her preferred scope and enough ammunition to fight a small war. But it was the additional equipment that told her how seriously Command was taking this mission. Night vision goggles with thermal imaging capability, satellite communication equipment that would keep her in contact with base no matter how deep into the mountains she went, enough C4 explosives to level a building, and most importantly, a drone controller that would give her eyes in the sky whenever she needed them. You'll be operating alone for the most part, Santos explained. We can provide drone surveillance and extraction if necessary, but once you're in the field, you're essentially a one-woman army. Support team? Local assets. Afghans who have their own reasons for wanting al-Rashid dead. He's been brutal in his control of the local villages, using fear and violence to maintain his power base. These people want him gone as much as we do. Sarah nodded. It made sense. The best intelligence always came from locals who understood the terrain and the enemy's habits. When do I insert? Tomorrow night. New moon. Perfect conditions for a ghost. Santos paused. Sarah, I need you to understand something. What you're about to do, it's going to change you. I've seen it happen to other operators who've gone down this path. The line between justice and revenge can get pretty thin out there. Sarah looked at the photo of Bravo Squad one more time, then set it aside. Colonel Whitfield asked me the same thing. But those men died because someone betrayed them, because al-Rashid and his people thought American soldiers were easy targets. It's time to show them how wrong they are. The Taliban are already calling al-Rashid's network the Mountain Ghosts because of how they appear and disappear in the Hindu Kush. They think they're hunting us. Santos's smile was predatory. They have no idea that we're about to send our own ghosts to hunt them. That night, as Sarah cleaned her rifle and prepared her equipment, she thought about Marcus Chen's final transmission. Tell my family I love them. She would carry that message home when this was over, but first she had her own message to send to the mountains. The ghost was coming, and the hunt was about to begin.
The insertion went perfectly, too perfectly, Sarah thought as she watched the helicopter disappear into the darkness. She was alone now, 3 miles from the nearest American base, deep in Taliban-controlled territory, with nothing but her training and her weapons to keep her alive. The silence of the Afghan mountains was absolute, broken only by the distant howl of wind through the peaks. Sarah had been dropped at an elevation of 8,000 feet, high enough that the thin air made every movement require extra effort, but she was used to operating in harsh conditions. What concerned her wasn't the environment. It was how easily she had been able to infiltrate this deep into enemy territory. Either al-Rashid's network wasn't as sophisticated as intelligence suggested, or this was exactly what they wanted. She activated her night vision goggles and began the 3-hour hike to her first observation point. According to the intelligence Santos had provided, al-Rashid's compound was built into the side of a mountain, using natural caves and constructed bunkers to create a fortress that could withstand conventional assault. But Sarah wasn't planning a conventional assault. The plan was elegantly simple. Identify the key members of al-Rashid's cell, eliminate them one by one, and save the leader for last. She would become their nightmare, a ghost that struck without warning and disappeared without a trace. By the time she was finished, the network that had killed Bravo Squad would be nothing but a memory. But as Sarah made her way through the rocky terrain, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something bigger than a simple revenge mission. The intelligence had been too clean, too convenient, and there was something about Staff Sergeant Pierce that didn't add up. Why would a communications specialist with a clean record suddenly decide to betray his own countrymen? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices carried on the wind. Sarah dropped to a prone position behind a cluster of rocks and activated her thermal scope. 200 meters ahead, she could see 3 heat signatures moving along what appeared to be a patrol route.
Taliban fighters, armed with AK-47s and moving with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned these mountains. Sarah smiled grimly. It was time to begin teaching them how wrong they were. She settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as she had done thousands of times before. The lead fighter was young, maybe 18 years old, walking point with his weapon at the ready. The second was older, more experienced, his movements suggesting military training. The third lagged behind, smoking what appeared to be a cigarette, despite being on patrol. Sarah could take all three with rapid precision shots, but that wasn't the plan. She needed information, and dead men couldn't provide that. Instead, she tracked their movement pattern, memorizing their route and timing. She would let them pass and continue to the compound, but now she knew they had regular patrols in the area. As the Taliban fighters disappeared into the darkness, Sarah resumed her approach to the observation point. It was a natural cave system that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes, exactly the kind of position she would have chosen herself. But as she settled in to set up her equipment, she found something that made her blood run cold. Someone had been here before her, recently. The signs were subtle: a scuffed footprint in the cave entrance, a small piece of fabric caught on a rock, the faint smell of American MREs. Someone else was operating in this area, someone who knew enough about military tactics to choose the same observation point she had selected. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. It could be another American operator conducting a parallel mission. It could be special forces gathering intelligence. Or it could be something else entirely, something that suggested this mission was even more complicated than she had been led to believe. She activated her satellite communication system and sent a coded message back to base. Ghost Actual to Overwatch. Request verification of all friendly assets in operational area. The response came back within minutes. Ghost Actual, no friendly assets in your operational area. You are alone out there. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. If there were no other American operators in the area, then who had been using her observation point? And why did she have the growing suspicion that she was walking into a trap that had been months in the making? She decided to proceed with caution. Using her drone controller, she launched a small reconnaissance drone that would give her eyes on the compound while she remained hidden in the cave. The drone's cameras revealed exactly what the intelligence had promised: a heavily fortified compound built into the mountainside with multiple defensive positions and what appeared to be a sophisticated communications array. But it was what the drone showed her next that changed everything. There, clearly visible in the compound's main courtyard, was a figure she recognized from the intelligence photos. But it wasn't Hakim al-Rashid. It was Staff Sergeant David Pierce, the communications specialist who was supposed to be locked up at Bagram Airfield awaiting court-martial. Pierce was very much free, very much alive, and very much in the middle of what was supposed to be a Taliban compound. He was talking animatedly with a group of men Sarah didn't recognize, gesturing toward papers spread out on a table. Even through the drone's cameras, she could see that he looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man among friends rather than a prisoner or defector. Sarah realized with growing horror that she hadn't been sent to hunt al-Rashid's terrorist network. She had been sent to eliminate the evidence of something much larger and much more dangerous. Pierce wasn't just a traitor who had sold information for money. He was part of a complex operation that went beyond anything she had been briefed on. And now she was alone in enemy territory, with no backup, no support, and no idea who she could trust. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was about to get much more deadly.
Sarah Morrison had been betrayed before, by politicians who didn't understand war, by commanders who cared more about politics than soldiers, by a system that sometimes forgot the people who bled for it. But this betrayal cut deeper than all the others combined. Someone had used Marcus Chen's death, had used her grief and her loyalty to send her into what was clearly a trap. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. Sarah spent the next 6 hours watching the compound through her drone, mapping every entrance, every guard position, every pattern of movement.
What she discovered painted a picture that made her stomach turn. This wasn't a Taliban terrorist cell. This was a sophisticated intelligence operation, and Pierce was at its center. The compound housed at least 30 men, but only half of them looked like typical Taliban fighters. The others moved with military precision, carried advanced weapons, and operated equipment that suggested training far beyond what local insurgents typically possessed. Most telling of all, they had communication equipment that could intercept American military transmissions, the kind of setup that would allow them to predict and counter every move the conventional forces made. Pierce wasn't a traitor who had sold out to the enemy. He was running a rogue intelligence operation, using his position at Bagram to feed information to a private army that was masquerading as Taliban insurgents. But the question remained, who was he working for, and what was the ultimate goal? Sarah's satellite communication system crackled to life, startling her from her surveillance. It was Colonel Whitfield. "Ghost Actual, this is Overwatch. Sit rep." Sarah hesitated before responding. How much could she trust anyone in the command structure now? If Pierce had been operating freely for months, feeding intelligence to hostile forces, then his network had to include people at Bagram, possibly including people who had briefed her on this mission. "Overwatch, Ghost Actual, eyes on target compound. Situation is complex." "Elaborate, Captain." "Request immediate extraction. This is not what we were briefed for." There was a long pause before Whitfield responded. "Ghost Actual, extraction is not possible at this time. Weather conditions have grounded all aircraft in your area. Complete your mission and proceed to alternate extraction point Alpha." Sarah knew that was a lie. The weather was clear and she could see stars through the cave opening. Someone wanted her to stay in the field, to continue with whatever plan they had set in motion. The question was whether Whitfield was part of it or if he was being fed false information from Pierce's network. "Acknowledged, Overwatch. Ghost Actual out." Sarah shut down her communication system and sat back to think. She was on her own now, with no backup and no way to know who she could trust. But she wasn't helpless. She was a ghost, and ghosts were very good at making problems disappear. If Pierce and his network wanted to play games with American lives, she was going to give them a game they would never forget. The first target presented itself just after midnight. A patrol was making its way along the perimeter of the compound, following the same route Sarah had observed earlier. But this time, instead of 3 Taliban fighters, it was 2 men in civilian clothes carrying American M4 rifles, clearly part of Pierce's private army. Sarah settled behind her Barrett rifle and acquired the target. 700 meters, slight crosswind from the east, target moving at a walking pace. It was an easy shot, the kind she could make in her sleep, but as she placed her finger on the trigger, she hesitated. Once she pulled that trigger, there would be no going back. She would officially become what Colonel Whitfield had asked her to become, a killer operating outside the rules of engagement, a ghost who solved problems with violence rather than justice. But then she thought of Marcus Chen's final transmission, of Rodriguez laughing at terrible jokes, of Thompson humming country songs. These men had died because of Pierce's betrayal, because of his greed and his willingness to sacrifice American lives for whatever goal he was pursuing. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and 700 meters away, one of Pierce's soldiers dropped like a stone. His partner spun around, trying to identify the source of the shot, but Sarah was already gone, fading back into the shadows of the cave like the ghost she was. The reaction in the compound was immediate and telling. Instead of the confused panic she would have expected from Taliban fighters, the response was organized and professional. Lights came on in specific buildings, men moved to predetermined positions, and within minutes they had established a perimeter and begun a systematic search of the surrounding area. These weren't insurgents, they were soldiers. Sarah used the confusion to her advantage, slipping out of the cave system through a back entrance and working her way to a secondary observation point she had identified earlier. From this new position, she could see directly into the compound's command center, where Pierce was coordinating the response to her attack. She watched through her scope as Pierce spoke into a radio handset, gesturing angrily toward the mountains. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but his body language suggested that he was under pressure from someone who wanted results and wasn't happy with how the situation was developing. For the first time since discovering Pierce at the compound, Sarah smiled. She had managed to rattle them with a single shot. Now it was time to really get their attention. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah became a nightmare stalking the mountains around the compound. She eliminated 2 more patrols, destroyed a communications array with a precisely placed shot, and even managed to disable a vehicle by putting a round through its engine block. Each attack was calculated to cause maximum psychological impact while revealing nothing about her position or intentions. By dawn, the compound was in a state of siege. The men inside knew they were being hunted, but they had no idea by whom or how many enemies they faced. Sarah could see the fear in their movements, the way they jumped at shadows and startled at unexpected sounds. But Pierce, however, seemed more angry than frayed. Sarah watched him through her scope as he paced back and forth in the command center, barking orders into his radio. She could take the shot, end this entire operation with a one squeeze of the trigger. But she needed information first. She needed to know who Pierce was working for and what they were ultimately planning. As the sun rose over the Hindu Kush Mountains, Sarah Morrison had officially become what her enemies would soon learn to fear: the Angel of Death, hunting in the shadows and striking without warning. But this was only the beginning of her war against the network that had killed her brothers.
The Taliban fighters in the local villages had begun whispering about the ghost in the mountains. They spoke in hushed tones about mysterious deaths, about sentries who simply vanished in the night, about an invisible enemy who struck without warning and disappeared like smoke. Some claimed it was the spirit of a dead American soldier seeking revenge for fallen comrades. Others believed it was a jinn, a supernatural being sent to punish the unfaithful. They were closer to the truth than they realized. Sarah had been operating around Pierce's compound for 3 days now, and her psychological warfare campaign was working better than she had dared hope. The 30 men inside the fortress had been reduced to 23, with the missing 7 either dead or so terrified that they had simply abandoned their posts and fled into the night. Those who remained were jumpy, exhausted, and making increasingly desperate mistakes. But Sarah's greatest victory wasn't the fear she had instilled in Pierce's army. It was the intelligence she had gathered by listening to their radio communications. Using equipment she had taken from one of the patrols she had eliminated, she had been monitoring their frequencies and slowly piecing together the scope of the operation she had stumbled into. Pierce wasn't working for a foreign government or a terrorist organization. He was working for a private military contractor called Blackwater Industries, a company that officially didn't exist but had contracts with intelligence agencies around the world. Their mission in Afghanistan was to identify and eliminate American military personnel who had discovered evidence of illegal arms stealing, drug trafficking, and war profiteering by certain elements within the military-industrial complex. Marcus Chen and Bravo Squad hadn't died because they were betrayed by Pierce. They had died because they had stumbled across evidence of the arms dealing operation during their reconnaissance mission. Pierce had fed them false intelligence, sending them directly into an ambush to silence them permanently. And Sarah? She had been sent not to avenge her fallen comrades, but to eliminate the last loose end, the one person who would never stop investigating Chen's death.
The plan had been for her to attack the compound, get captured or killed in the process, and disappear forever in the mountains of Afghanistan. Just another casualty of the endless war on terror. But the planners had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated Captain Sarah Morrison. Sarah was finishing her analysis of the intercepted communications when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. She grabbed her binoculars and scanned the horizon, spotting two Black Hawk helicopters flying low and fast toward the compound. Reinforcements were arriving, which meant Pierce had finally convinced his handlers that he needed help dealing with his ghost problem. The helicopters landed in the compound's central courtyard, and Sarah watched through her scope as 12 men in tactical gear disembarked. These weren't Taliban fighters, or even Pierce's private army. These were professional operators, the kind of elite soldiers that Blackwater Industries recruited from special forces units around the world. Leading them was a figure that made Sarah's blood run cold. Major Thomas Blackwood, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, now apparently working for the same organization that had ordered the deaths of her friends. Sarah had served with Blackwood in Iraq, had trusted him with her life on multiple occasions, and had considered him one of the finest soldiers she had ever known. Seeing him step off that helicopter, knowing that he was part of the network that had killed Chen and the others, was like a physical blow to her chest. How deep did this conspiracy go? How many people she had trusted were part of it? Sarah watched as Blackwood conferred with Pierce, pointing toward the mountains where she had been operating. Even from a distance, she could see the confidence returning to Pierce's demeanor. He believed that Blackwood and his team would be able to track down and eliminate whatever force had been harassing his compound. They had no idea they were hunting a single woman who had nothing left to lose. That night, Sarah decided to send a message that would shake Pierce's network to its core. Instead of picking off isolated patrols or conducting hit-and-run attacks, she was going to strike directly at the compound itself. It was a dangerous plan, potentially suicidal, but it would demonstrate once and for all that their fortress wasn't as impregnable as they believed. She spent hours planning her approach, using her knowledge of the compound's layout to identify the optimal infiltration route. The key was a drainage system that ran beneath the complex, part of the original construction, that had been designed to channel rainwater away from the caves and bunkers. It would be tight, dangerous, and would leave her with no escape route if she was discovered. But it would also get her inside their perimeter undetected. At 0200 hours, Sarah began her infiltration. She had left most of her equipment at her observation point, carrying only her sidearm, a knife, enough explosives to destroy the compound's communications equipment, and her father's compass, a talisman that had kept her alive through 3 deployments and countless firefights. The drainage tunnel was even worse than she had anticipated. Built for water rather than human passage, it forced her to crawl on her belly through spaces barely wide enough for her shoulders. The rocks scraped her uniform and cut her skin, and more than once she had to stop and fight off the claustrophobic panic that threatened to overwhelm her. But she pressed on, driven by the memory of Marcus Chen's final transmission and the knowledge that their killers were sleeping peacefully just meters above her head. It took her nearly an hour to reach the point where the drainage system connected to the lower levels of the complex. Using her knife, she carefully pried open a grate that provided access to what appeared to be a storage area. She listened carefully for several minutes, ensuring that the area was unoccupied, before slipping through the opening and finding herself inside Pierce's fortress. Now the real work could begin. Sarah moved through the compound like a shadow, using her training and instincts to avoid the patrols that Blackwood had established. Her first stop was the communications center, where a single guard sat monitoring radio frequencies and surveillance cameras. Sarah approached him behind, covering his mouth with her hand while pressing her knife against his throat. "Make a sound and you die," she whispered in his ear. "Nod if you understand." The guard nodded frantically, terror evident in his eyes. "Good. Where is Pierce?" The guard pointed towards a staircase leading to the upper levels of the compound. She could see his hands shaking as he tried to comply with her demands. "How many guards between here and there?" He held up 3 fingers. Sarah smiled grimly. "Thank you for your cooperation." Before the guard could react, she struck him with the pommel of her knife, rendering him unconscious but alive. She wasn't a murderer, she was a soldier seeking justice for her fallen comrades.
The explosive Sarah planted in the communication center would detonate in exactly 15 minutes, giving her just enough time to reach Pierce before the compound erupted into chaos. But as she made her way through the darkened corridors, she realized that her plan had one critical flaw. Blackwood knew her tactics better than anyone else alive. They had served together for 2 years in Iraq, had conducted dozens of joint operations, and had trained together at the Army's most elite schools. If anyone could predict her next move, it would be Thomas Blackwood, which meant he was probably already waiting for her. Sarah was proven right when she rounded a corner and found herself face to face with the man she had once considered a brother in arms. Blackwood stood in the center of a corridor intersection, his weapon lowered but ready, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Hello, Ghost," he said quietly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Thomas." Sarah kept her own weapon trained on him, but her heart was breaking. "Why?" "Same reason you're here, I imagine. They threatened people I care about. My family, my sister's kids. They have files on everyone, Sarah. Every operator, every soldier who might cause them problems. They made it clear that I could either work with them or watch my family disappear." "So you chose to betray everything we swore to protect?" Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Protect what? A system that sends good soldiers to die for oil companies and defense contractors? A government that lies to its own people about why we're really here? Sarah, we've been fighting other people's wars for profit, and now some of us have decided to get our share." Chen and his team died because of that attitude. Good men with families, with futures. Chen and his team died because they stumbled across something they shouldn't have seen. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yes, that's tragic, but their deaths served a greater purpose. Sarah felt the cold fury that had been building inside her for days finally boil over. A greater purpose? What greater purpose could possibly justify murdering 6 American soldiers? The purpose of ending this war, the arms dealing, the intelligence gathering, it's all part of a larger plan to destabilize the region enough that Congress will finally vote to bring everyone home. No more American casualties, no more endless deployments, no more families torn apart by a conflict that can't be won. By becoming the very thing we swore to fight against? Before Blackwood could answer, the compound shook with the force of Sarah's explosives detonating in the communication center. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a red glow that made the scene even more surreal. In the distance, Sarah could hear shouting as Pierce's men responded to the attack. "You need to come with me, Sarah," Blackwood said urgently. "Pierce wants you dead, but I can get you out of here. We can fake your death, give you a new identity, set you up somewhere safe. You don't have to die for this." "The same offer you made to Chen?" Blackwood's expression hardened. Chen wouldn't listen. He was going to expose the entire operation, cost hundreds of lives when the war escalated. I gave him every chance to walk away. "You killed him!" "I saved him from a much worse death. Pierce wanted to torture him first, get the names of everyone he had talked to. I made sure it was quick and clean." Sarah stared at the man she had once trusted with her life, trying to reconcile the soldier she remembered with the killer standing before her. "You've become a monster, Thomas. I've become a realist. The world isn't black and white, Sarah. Sometimes good people have to do terrible things to achieve a greater good." "And what happens when I refuse your offer?" Blackwood raised his weapon. "Then I'll make sure your death is as quick and painless as Chen's. It's the least I can do for an old friend." Sarah smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes.
You know, Thomas, you made one critical mistake in your planning. What's that? You assumed I came alone. The confusion on Blackwood's face lasted exactly 1 second before the corridor erupted in gunfire. But it wasn't reinforcements that Sarah had called, it was the local villagers who had been suffering under Pierce's reign of terror, Afghan fighters who had their own reasons for wanting the compound destroyed. Sarah had spent the previous day making contact with the local resistance, sharing intelligence about Pierce's operation, and convincing them that the Americans inside the compound were not their enemies, but their enemies. The explosion in the communication center had been their signal to attack. As gunfire echoed through the corridors and Blackwood dived for cover, Sarah pressed her advantage. She moved with the fluid grace that had earned her the call sign Ghost, appearing and disappearing in the red-lit chaos like a supernatural force. Pierce's private army, caught between Sarah's sabotage from within and the Afghan assault from without, began to crumble. These men were mercenaries, not soldiers, and when faced with a coordinated attack from multiple directions, their discipline broke down completely. Sarah found Pierce in his command center, frantically trying to establish communication with the outside world using a backup radio system. He looked up as she entered, his face pale with fear and rage. Captain Sarah Morrison, the famous Ghost, you have no idea what you've just destroyed. I know exactly what I've destroyed. A network of traitors who sold out American soldiers for money, men who betrayed everything they swore to protect. You think this is about money? Pierce laughed hysterically. This is about survival, about preventing a war that would kill thousands more Americans. We were trying to save lives. By taking lives, by murdering my friends. Your friends were going to destroy years of careful planning. They were going to expose an operation that would have ended this conflict and brought everyone home. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. After everything she had seen, everything she had learned, this was the moment she had been working toward. Justice for Marcus Chen, for Rodriguez, for Thompson, for all the good soldiers who had died because of Pierce's betrayal. But as she looked into Pierce's eyes, she saw something unexpected. Genuine belief. This man actually thought he was doing the right thing, actually believed that his betrayals and murders were justified by some greater good. It didn't change what he had done. It didn't bring back her friends. But it made her realize that killing him wouldn't end the cycle of violence that had consumed so many good people. Tell me, Sarah said quietly, do you have any last words for the families of the men you killed? Pierce looked at her with something approaching respect. Just tell them I'm sorry. Tell them it wasn't supposed to happen this way. I'll be sure to pass along the message, Sarah said, and pulled the trigger. As Pierce fell, Sarah felt something inside her break and reform. She was no longer the soldier who had arrived in Afghanistan seeking justice. She had become something else, something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The Ghost had become the angel of death, and her war was far from over.
The compound burned through the night, orange flames reaching toward the stars as if trying to carry the souls of the dead to whatever judgment awaited them. Sarah Morrison stood on a ridge 2 miles away, watching the destruction through her rifle scope and feeling absolutely nothing. The woman who had arrived in Afghanistan 3 days ago, seeking justice for her fallen friends, was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The angel of death had been born. But Sarah's war was far from over. As she monitored the radio frequencies, she intercepted multiple transmissions that made it clear Pierce's operation had been just one cell in a much larger network. Blackwater Industries had similar compounds throughout Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, all run by former American military personnel who had convinced themselves that betraying their own countrymen was a patriotic act.
The radio chatter revealed something else that chilled Sarah to the bone. There was a list, a kill list containing the names of every American soldier, intelligence officer, and government official who posed a threat to Blackwater's operations. Marcus Chen's name had been on that list, along with Rodriguez, Thompson, and the rest of Bravo's squad. But they hadn't been the only ones. According to the transmissions Sarah intercepted, 17 other American servicemen had been eliminated over the past 6 months, all killed in what appeared to be Taliban attacks or unfortunate accidents. The official reports blamed enemy action, equipment failure, or simple bad luck. The reality was systematic murder carried out by the very people who had sworn to protect them. And at the top of that list, marked with the designation Tier 1 Priority, was Sarah's own name. She should have felt fear. She should have felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she was facing. Instead, she felt only a cold, calculating rage that seemed to burn in her chest like a piece of ice. They had made this personal when they killed her friends. Now she was going to make it personal for them. Using the intelligence she had gathered from Pierce's compound, Sarah began tracking the locations of other Blackwater cells operating in the region. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and chilling. They had effectively created a parallel intelligence network that could monitor and manipulate American military operations throughout the Middle East. But they had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They had assumed that their targets would be conventional soldiers operating within the normal chain of command, people who could be eliminated through official channels or carefully orchestrated accidents. They hadn't planned for someone like Sarah, someone with the skills to operate completely outside the system, someone with nothing left to lose, and someone who had just learned how to kill without conscience. Sarah's first strike came 72 hours after the destruction of Pierce's compound. Intelligence intercepts had led her to a safe house in Kabul where 3 Blackwater operatives were coordinating with corrupt Afghan officials to arrange the deaths of 2 American intelligence officers who had been asking too many questions about weapons shipments. The safe house was a nondescript building in the old city, protected by local security forces who had been bought and paid for by Blackwater money. Under normal circumstances, it would have been virtually impossible for a single operative to infiltrate and eliminate multiple targets without triggering a massive response from the surrounding area. But Sarah Morrison was no longer operating under normal circumstances. She struck at dawn, during the call to prayer when the streets were filled with the faithful making their way to morning services at the local mosque. Using the crowd as cover, she approached the building from 3 different directions over the course of an hour, planting small explosive charges at strategic points that would bring down the entire structure. But before she triggered the charges, she wanted to send a message. Sarah used her sniper rifle to eliminate the exterior guards one by one, each shot placed with surgical precision to cause maximum psychological impact on anyone watching from inside the building. The guards didn't just die, they were eliminated in ways that made it clear to anyone who found them that they had been hunted by someone with extraordinary skill. As the surviving Blackwater operatives barricaded themselves inside the safe house, Sarah activated her improvised sound system, speakers she had positioned around the building during her reconnaissance, and began broadcasting a message that would haunt the dreams of every corrupt soldier in Afghanistan. My name is Captain Sarah Morrison, United States Army. You killed my friends. You murdered my brothers. Now I'm coming for all of you. To every American soldier who has betrayed their oath, who has sold their honor for money, who has traded the lives of their comrades for profit, I want you to know that I am hunting you. I will find you wherever you hide, and I will make you pay for every life you've taken. You think you know war. You think you understand what it means to fight for your life, but you've never faced someone like me. I am the ghost in your nightmares, the shadow in your periphery, the bullet you never hear coming. I am the angel of death, and your judgment day has arrived. As her words echoed through the Kabul morning, Sarah triggered the explosive charges that brought down the safe house in a cloud of dust and debris. The 3 Blackwater operatives inside died instantly, but that wasn't the point. The point was the message their deaths would send to every other corrupt operator in the region. The ghost was hunting, and no one was safe. News of the Kabul attack spread through military and intelligence channels within hours, but the official reports bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. According to the briefings that reached American commanders, the safe house had been destroyed by a Taliban bombing, and the 3 dead Americans were being posthumously honored as heroes who had died fighting terrorism. But in the shadows, in the encrypted communications between Blackwater cells, a different story was being told. They spoke in whispers about the ghost, about the American soldier who had gone rogue and was systematically hunting down their operatives. Some claimed she had supernatural abilities, that she could appear and disappear at will, like the jinn of Afghan folklore. Others insisted she was working with foreign intelligence agencies, that no single person could be responsible for the level of destruction she was causing. They were wrong on both counts. Sarah Morrison was very much human, and she was working entirely alone. But she had advantages that her enemies couldn't comprehend. She had nothing left to lose. She had the skills of an elite soldier combined with the fury of a betrayed friend, and she had just learned how to kill without conscience. Over the next week, Sarah eliminated 2 more Blackwater cells, each attack more audacious than the last. In Kandahar, she used a car bomb to destroy a meeting between corrupt Afghan police officials and Blackwater handlers who were arranging the assassination of an American journalist. In Herat, she infiltrated a heavily guarded compound and executed 4 former Special Forces operators who had been responsible for the deaths of an entire Marine reconnaissance team. Each attack followed the same pattern: surgical elimination of the targets, destruction of their facilities, and a message left behind that made it clear who was responsible. The Angel of Death was building a reputation that would follow her enemies into their nightmares. But as Sarah continued her one-woman war against the network that had killed her friends, she began to realize that she was changing. The woman who had once hesitated before taking a life, who had followed rules of engagement and tried to minimize collateral damage, was disappearing. In her place was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. She told herself it was necessary. These people had betrayed everything she had sworn to protect, had murdered good soldiers for money and power. They deserved whatever fate she brought them. But late at night, when she was alone with her thoughts and her memories, Sarah sometimes wondered if Marcus Chen would recognize the person she was becoming. Would he approve of the methods she was using to avenge his death? Would he want his memory to be honored through violence and vengeance? Those doubts lasted only until she remembered his final transmission. "Tell my family I love them." Chen had died believing in something larger than himself, trusting that his sacrifice meant something. Sarah would make sure that trust was not betrayed, no matter what it cost her soul.
The nightmare began for Blackwater Industries when their communications intercepted a message that sent shockwaves through their entire organization. It was broadcast on an encrypted frequency that only their highest-level operatives were supposed to know, transmitted from somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains at exactly 0300 hours local time. "This is the Angel of Death," Sarah's voice cut through the static with cold precision. "I know who you are. I know where you operate. I know the names of every American soldier you've killed, and I'm coming for every single one of you." But it wasn't just the words that terrified them. It was what she transmitted next. Detailed intelligence about Blackwater operations throughout the Middle East, complete with names, locations, and specific details about planned assassinations. Information that should have been impossible for any single operative to obtain, let alone someone operating completely outside official channels.
Sarah had spent the past 2 weeks doing more than just eliminating Blackwater cells. She had been building an intelligence network of her own, using her contacts in the local population and her growing reputation as the Angel of Death to gather information that even the CIA couldn't access. Afghan villagers who'd been brutalized by Blackwater operatives were suddenly very eager to share what they knew with the American ghost who was making their tormentors disappear. The effect on Blackwater's operations was immediate and devastating. Operatives who had been planning assassinations suddenly found their targets warned and protected. Safe houses that had been secret for months were abandoned as their locations became known to hostile forces. Most damaging of all, the network of corruption that had allowed Blackwater to operate with impunity began to collapse as their local assets realized they were backing the losing side. But Sarah's greatest victory came when she intercepted a communication that revealed the scope of Blackwater's infiltration of the American military command structure. The network included officers at every level, from staff sergeants to full colonels, all of whom had been compromised through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and ideological conversion. Among those names was one that hit Sarah like a physical blow: Colonel James Whitfield, her commanding officer and the man who had sent her on this mission in the first place. Everything suddenly made sense. Whitfield hadn't sent her to Afghanistan to avenge Bravo Squad. He had sent her to be eliminated by Pierce's network, to become another casualty in Blackwater's war against American soldiers who posed a threat to their operations. The mission had been designed to fail from the very beginning, with Sarah as the intended victim. But something had gone wrong with their plan. Instead of being killed or captured, Sarah had become something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. She had become a force of nature, an unstoppable hunter who was systematically destroying everything they had built. The realization that Whitfield had betrayed her should have been devastating. Instead, Sarah felt only a cold satisfaction. Now she knew exactly who was responsible for Marcus Chen's death, and she knew where to find him. Bagram Airfield was the most heavily defended American installation in Afghanistan, protected by multiple layers of security and thousands of personnel. Under normal circumstances, it would have been suicide for a single operative to attempt an infiltration, but Sarah Morrison was no longer operating under normal circumstances. She had spent 3 weeks in the mountains, surviving on minimal supplies and conducting a one-woman war against a network of trained killers. The experience had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essential core of who she was: a soldier, a hunter, and an instrument of vengeance. Sarah's approach to Bagram was methodical and patient. She spent 4 days conducting surveillance, mapping every security patrol, every checkpoint, every routine that governed life on the base. She identified weaknesses in their perimeter, gaps in their surveillance coverage, and most importantly, she learned the patterns of movement that would allow her to reach Colonel Whitfield's office without being detected. But she wasn't planning to infiltrate the base alone. Using her network of local contacts, Sarah had recruited a team of Afghan fighters who had their own reasons for wanting to strike at Bagram. These weren't Taliban insurgents. They were villagers whose families had been killed by Blackwater operations, men who had watched their communities destroyed by American soldiers who had sold their honor for money. Sarah didn't ask them to help her infiltrate the base. Instead, she asked them to create a distraction that would draw security forces away from her target. It was a suicide mission for most of them, and they knew it, but they also knew that the Angel of Death had kept her promises so far, and they believed that her success would bring justice for their own losses. The attack began at midnight with mortar fire directed at the base's outer perimeter. As security forces responded to the apparent Taliban assault, Sarah used the chaos to slip through a drainage system that connected to the base's internal infrastructure. It was the same technique she had used at Pierce's compound, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. Moving through the tunnels beneath Bagram felt like crawling through the bowels of hell. The concrete was slick with condensation and decades of accumulated filth, and the sound of gunfire from above echoed through the enclosed space like thunder. But Sarah pressed forward, driven by the memory of Marcus Chen's final transmission and the knowledge that Colonel Whitfield was somewhere above her, probably coordinating the defense against the very attack she had orchestrated. When she finally emerged from the drainage system into the basement of the administration building, Sarah found herself in familiar territory. She had been in this building dozens of times during her previous deployments, had walked these corridors as a loyal soldier, following orders from officers she trusted. Now she was walking the same corridors as an avenging angel, come to deliver justice to the man who had betrayed that trust. The building was largely empty, with most personnel responding to the attack on the perimeter. Sarah made her way through the darkened corridors using memory and instinct, her weapon ready, but her mind focused on the confrontation ahead. This wasn't going to be another surgical elimination like the ones she had conducted over the past weeks. This was personal. She found Colonel Whitfield in his office, hunched over a radio as he coordinated the base's defense. He looked up as she entered, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "Captain Sarah Morrison, the famous Angel of Death. I wondered when you would come for me." "Why?" Sarah asked, her weapon trained on the man who had been like a father to her. "Why did you sell us out?" Whitfield leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "Because I was tired, Sarah. Tired of watching good soldiers die for oil companies and defense contractors. Tired of fighting a war that couldn't be won. When Blackwater offered me a way to end it all, to bring everyone home, I took it. By murdering American soldiers? By doing what was necessary to prevent a larger catastrophe. The arms dealing, the intelligence operations, it was all designed to destabilize the region enough that Congress would finally vote to withdraw. No more deployments, no more casualties, no more families destroyed by endless war." Sarah stared at the man she had once respected, trying to reconcile the officer she remembered with the traitor sitting before her. "Chen trusted you. They all trusted you. And their deaths will save thousands of other lives when this war finally ends. Sometimes good people have to make terrible sacrifices for the greater good." "Whose greater good?" Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Yours? Blackwater's? Or the families of the soldiers you've murdered?" Before Whitfield could answer, the office door exploded inward as MP security forces finally tracked her location. Sarah spun toward the new threat, her training taking over as she engaged multiple targets in the confined space of the office. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but when it was over, 3 MPs were down and Sarah had taken a bullet through her left shoulder. As she turned back toward Whitfield, she found him reaching for a pistol in his desk drawer. "Don't," she warned, but he continued reaching for the weapon. Sarah's final shot took Colonel James Whitfield in the chest, ending the life of the man who had sent her friends to die and nearly succeeded in having her killed as well. As he fell, Sarah felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion, only emptiness, and the knowledge that her war was far from over.
The aftermath of Colonel Whitfield's death sent shockwaves through the American military establishment that reached all the way back to Washington, D.C. The official story spoke of a tragic friendly fire incident during a Taliban attack on Bagram airfield, but the classified reports painted a different picture entirely. They described a rogue American soldier who had somehow infiltrated one of the most secure installations in Afghanistan and eliminated a high-ranking officer along with multiple security personnel. But those reports couldn't capture the true impact of what Sarah Morrison had accomplished. In the space of less than a month, she had single-handedly dismantled a network that had taken years to establish, eliminated dozens of corrupt operatives, and exposed a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the American military-industrial complex.
The surviving members of Blackwater Industries were in full retreat, abandoning operations throughout the Middle East and desperately trying to cover their tracks before the Angel of Death could find them. But Sarah had already obtained their complete operational database during her infiltration of Bagram, and she knew exactly where each of them was hiding. Her shoulder wound had become infected during her escape from the airbase, and she was running a fever that should have incapacitated most people. But Sarah Morrison was no longer most people. The weeks in the mountains had burned away everything soft and unnecessary, leaving only the essential core of a predator. Pain was irrelevant. Fatigue was irrelevant. Only the mission mattered. Her next target was the man who had coordinated the entire Blackwater operation from behind the scenes, General Marcus Steele, a decorated veteran who had been collecting bribes and coordinating assassinations from his comfortable office in Qatar. Steele commanded a logistics operation that was officially responsible for managing supply lines throughout the Middle East, but in reality served as the distribution network for Blackwater's arms dealing and intelligence operations. Sarah's approach to General Steele would require a different strategy than her previous eliminations. Qatar was an ally nation with strict security protocols, and Steele was surrounded by legitimate American military personnel who had no idea they were working for a traitor. She couldn't simply assault his compound and eliminate everyone inside. Too many innocent soldiers would die in the crossfire. Instead, she would have to become what she had always been best at being, a ghost. Sarah's infiltration of the American base in Qatar took 3 days of patient preparation. Using forged orders that she had created from templates stolen during her raid on Bagram, she presented herself as a special operations consultant conducting a security assessment of the facility. Her reputation as a decorated sniper and the chaos surrounding recent events in Afghanistan provided enough cover for her to gain access without triggering immediate suspicion. But she knew she didn't have long before someone verified her credentials and discovered that Captain Sarah Morrison was officially listed as missing in action and presumed dead. She would have to move quickly and decisively to complete her mission before her cover was blown. General Steele's office was located in the most secure section of the base, accessible only through multiple checkpoints and surrounded by his personal security detail. Under normal circumstances, it would have been impossible for any individual to reach him without official authorization. But Sarah had spent the past month learning that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. Her plan was elegantly simple. She would attend the evening briefing that Steele held for his staff officers, and she would kill him in front of witnesses. It was a suicide mission, but it would send a message that would echo throughout the military establishment for years to come. No one who betrayed American soldiers would be safe, no matter how high their rank or how secure their position. The briefing room was crowded with officers and senior enlisted personnel, all gathered to receive updates on the logistics operations that kept American forces supplied throughout the region. Sarah took a seat in the back of the room, her uniform and bearing allowing her to blend in perfectly with the other military professionals in attendance. General Steele entered precisely at 1900 hours, a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s whose chest was covered with ribbons and decorations that testified to a lifetime of military service. Looking at him, it would have been impossible to tell that he was responsible for dozens of American soldiers, that he had sold out his own countrymen for money and power. As Steele began his briefing, discussing supply routes and equipment deliveries with the casual competence of a career logistics officer, Sarah found herself studying the faces of the other people in the room. These were good soldiers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving their country and protecting their fellow Americans. They had no idea that the man they respected and followed was a traitor who would sacrifice any of them without hesitation if it served his purposes. Ladies and gentlemen, Steele was saying, "I want to address some recent concerns about security protocols in light of the tragic events at Bagram Airfield. We've received intelligence suggesting that there may be hostile operatives attempting to infiltrate American facilities throughout the region." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. Steele was warning his people about her, describing her as a hostile operative, while he stood before them as the very kind of traitor she had been sent to eliminate. "The individual we're concerned about goes by the call sign Angel of Death and has been responsible for multiple attacks on American personnel and facilities. She should be considered extremely dangerous and potentially unstable." Sarah did smile now, a cold expression that made several nearby officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Steele continued his briefing, oblivious to the fact that his target was sitting less than 20 feet away from him, listening to every word. "Intel suggests that this rogue operative may be suffering from PTSD or other psychological trauma that has caused her to turn against her own countrymen. She has killed American soldiers and civilians without discrimination, and she represents a clear and present danger to all personnel in the region." Sarah stood up slowly, her movement casual enough that it didn't immediately attract attention. But something about her posture, about the way she carried herself, began to register with the military professionals around her. These were good soldiers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving their country and protecting their fellow Americans. They had no idea that the man they respected and followed was a traitor who would sacrifice any of them without hesitation if it served his purposes. "General Steele," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "I believe you're talking about me." The room erupted into chaos as officers reached for sidearms and security personnel moved to intercept what they perceived as an assassination attempt. But Sarah was already in motion, her years of training and her recent experience as a hunter combining to make her faster and more deadly than anyone in the room. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds. When it was over, General Steele was dead, 3 security personnel were wounded but alive, and Sarah Morrison had vanished into the base's infrastructure as if she had never existed. But she had left behind something that would haunt the dreams of every corrupt official in the military, the knowledge that the Angel of Death was real, that she could reach anyone, anywhere, and that no amount of security or rank would protect those who betrayed their oath.
3 months after the death of General Steele, Sarah Morrison had become something of a myth throughout the American military. Some called her a hero, a soldier who had exposed corruption and brought justice to those who had betrayed their comrades. Others labeled her a terrorist, a rogue operative who had murdered fellow Americans and threatened the stability of military operations worldwide. The truth, as it often is, was far more complicated than either version of the story. Sarah had continued her campaign against the remaining Blackwater operatives, tracking them from Qatar to Iraq to Syria, and finally back to the United States itself. Each elimination was carried out with surgical precision, each death serving as both justice for past crimes and a warning to future traitors. The network that had taken years to build was systematically dismantled by one woman with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. But the cost of that campaign was becoming evident in ways that Sarah herself couldn't recognize. The woman who had entered Afghanistan seeking justice for her fallen friends had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She no longer hesitated before taking a life, no longer questioned whether her targets deserved their fate. She had become the perfect weapon, efficient and remorseless, but she had lost something essential in the process. The final confrontation came in a nondescript warehouse in Baltimore, where the last 3 surviving Blackwater operatives had arranged to meet with arms dealers who could provide them with new identities and safe passage out of the country. These weren't soldiers or intelligence officers. They were accountants and logistics specialists who had facilitated the network's operations from behind computer screens and spreadsheets. Sarah could have eliminated them from a distance,
picked them off with her rifle as they entered the warehouse, and vanished before anyone realized what had happened. It would have been clean, efficient, and completely in character with her previous operations. Instead, she chose to confront them face to face. "My name is Captain Sarah Morrison," she announced as she stepped out of the shadows, her weapon trained on the three terrified men. "You killed my friends. You betrayed your oath, and now you're going to pay for what you've done." The eldest of the three, a man named Patterson, who had been responsible for laundering the money that funded Blackwater's assassination operations, fell to his knees and began begging for his life. "Please, Captain, we were just following orders. We never killed anyone directly. We were just doing paperwork." Sarah studied his face, seeing the fear and desperation of a man who had suddenly realized that his crimes had consequences. Just paperwork? Marcus Chen died because of your paperwork. Rodriguez, Thompson, Jenkins, all of them died because you processed the payments that made their murders possible. "We can make this right," another man pleaded. "We have evidence, records of everyone who was involved. We can testify, help you expose the whole operation." Sarah almost laughed. "Expose it to who? Your network included officers at every level of command. Half the people who would prosecute you are probably part of it. Then what do you want from us?" Sarah considered the question. What did she want? Justice? Revenge? The simple satisfaction of knowing that the last of Marcus Chen's killers were dead. Once she might have known the answer to that question, but the woman who had cared about such distinctions was gone, replaced by something that understood only the mathematics of death and retribution. "I want you to understand what you've taken from me," she said finally. "I want you to know that Marcus Chen was going to propose to his girlfriend when he got home from deployment. Rodriguez had a daughter who just learned to walk. Thompson was saving money to buy his parents a house. Please, I want you to know that they died in terror, calling for help that never came, because you sold them out for money." Sarah's voice was completely calm, devoid of emotion or inflection. "I want you to carry that knowledge with you when you die." The executions were quick and professional. Sarah felt no satisfaction as the bodies fell, no sense of completion or justice served. There was only emptiness, and the knowledge that she had become something that Marcus Chen would probably no longer recognize. As she prepared to leave the warehouse, Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. She almost ignored it. She had been operating without official contact for months now, existing completely outside the military chain of command. But something about the timing made her check the display. The message was from an encrypted source, but the content was clear enough. "Ghost, this is Phoenix. Time to come home." Phoenix. The call sign belonged to Major Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's former commanding officer and one of the few people in the military that she still trusted completely. If Walsh was reaching out, it meant that someone in the official chain of command had decided that the Angel of Death's war was over. Sarah looked around the warehouse one final time, at the bodies of the men who had been part of the network that killed her friends, at the evidence of the campaign she had conducted across 3 countries and 4 countries. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do. The network was destroyed, the traitors were dead, and justice had been served. But the cost of that campaign was becoming evident in ways that Sarah herself couldn't recognize. The woman who had entered Afghanistan seeking justice for her fallen friends had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She no longer hesitated before taking a life, no longer questioned whether her targets deserved their fate. She had become the perfect weapon, efficient and remorseless, but she had lost something essential in the process. The question now was whether there was enough of Sarah Morrison left to find her way back to the world she had left behind, or whether the Angel of Death was all that remained.
As she walked out of the warehouse and into the Baltimore night, Sarah Morrison began the hardest mission of her military career: learning how to be human again. But that's a story for another day. Tonight she was still the ghost in the shadows, the angel who brought death to those who betrayed their oath, and the nightmare that would haunt the dreams of corrupt soldiers for generations to come. Her friends were avenged. The debt was paid. The hunt was over.
2 years later, Captain Sarah Morrison stood in Arlington National Cemetery, placing a small American flag beside Marcus Chen's headstone. The inscription was simple: Sergeant Marcus Chen, United States Army, beloved son, brother, and hero. But Sarah knew the words couldn't capture who he really was. The man who hummed off-key when he was nervous, who carried pictures of his nieces in his helmet, who had trusted his commanding officer enough to die following orders. The official record stated that Chen and Bravo Squad had died in a Taliban ambush, casualties of the endless war on terror. The classified files told a different story, one of betrayal and conspiracy that had required a congressional investigation and multiple court-martials to fully unravel. But those files were sealed, and the families of the dead were left with only the sanitized version of events. Sarah touched Chen's headstone gently. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "I told your family you loved them, and I made sure the people who killed you paid for what they did." But keeping that promise had cost her more than she could have imagined when she first arrived in Afghanistan seeking justice. The woman who had entered those mountains was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The angel of death had completed her mission, but Sarah Morrison was still trying to find her way back to being human. The transition hadn't been easy. When Major Walsh had finally brought her home, Sarah had spent 6 months in military hospitals and psychiatric facilities, trying to reconcile the soldier she had been with the weapon she had become. The therapists had labels for what she had experienced: PTSD, moral injury, survivor's guilt. But none of their words seemed adequate to describe the transformation that had taken place in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had killed 23 people during her campaign against Blackwater Industries, not in the heat of battle, not in self-defense, but in cold blood, as they begged for mercy and offered information in exchange for their lives. She told herself they had deserved it, that they were traitors who had forfeited any claim to compassion when they betrayed their fellow soldiers. But late at night, when the world was quiet and her mind was left alone with her memories, Sarah sometimes wondered if Marcus Chen would have approved of the methods she had used to avenge his death. Would he have wanted his memory honored through violence and retribution, or would he have preferred that she find another way to serve justice? "You always were the better person," she said to the headstone. "Even in the end, you were thinking about your family instead of revenge." A gentle hand touched her shoulder, and Sarah turned to see Major Walsh approaching through the rows of white marble. Jennifer Walsh had been the one to piece together what Sarah had accomplished during her months in the field, had been the one to convince the military brass that the angel of death was a hero rather than a terrorist. "How are you doing, Sarah?" Walsh asked, her voice carrying the kind of genuine concern that had made her one of the most respected officers in the Army. "Better," Sarah replied. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning to live with what I've done." What you did exposed a conspiracy that could have cost hundreds of lives. The Blackwater Network was planning to expand their operations, target more soldiers who posed a threat to their interests. You stopped that. Sarah nodded, but the reassurance felt hollow. "I know, but I also know that I became something I never intended to be. I lost myself in that mission, Jennifer. I became a killer." "You became what was necessary," Walsh corrected gently. "And now you're finding your way back to being Sarah Morrison. That's not easy, but it's possible."
They stood together in comfortable silence, two soldiers who had seen too much war and carried too many memories of fallen friends. Around them, Arlington stretched toward the horizon, acre after acre of white stones, marking the graves of men and women who had given everything in service to their country. "What's next for you?" Walsh asked. Sarah considered the question. The Army had offered her early retirement with full benefits, understanding that her experiences had earned her the right to choose her own path forward. She could disappear into civilian life, find some quiet corner of the world where the angel of death was just a memory. But that felt too much like abandoning the mission that Marcus Chen had died for, protecting American soldiers from those who would betray them for profit or power. "I'm going to teach," Sarah said finally. "The Army has offered me a position at the Special Operations School, training the next generation of soldiers and making sure they're ready for the kind of enemies they might face." "Enemies like the ones you faced?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time in months, it was a genuine expression, rather than a tactical mask. "Enemies like the one I became. If I can teach them to be better than that, to find justice without losing their humanity, then maybe Chen's death will have meant something after all." As they walked away from the gravesite, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that night in the Afghan mountains when she had decided to become the angel of death. Hope. Not the desperate hope of revenge or the cold satisfaction of justice served, but the simple human hope that she could build something positive from the ashes of what she had destroyed. The angel of death would always be part of her, a shadow that would follow her through whatever years remained. But Sarah Morrison was still alive somewhere beneath that shadow, still fighting to honor the memory of her fallen friends in ways that would make them proud. Marcus Chen's final words were, "Tell my family I love them." Sarah had carried that message across 3 continents and through 23 deaths. Now, finally, she was ready to carry a different message, that love could be stronger than revenge, that building was more important than destroying, and that even angels of death could choose to serve life. The hunt was over. The real mission was just beginning. As Sarah Morrison walked away from Arlington National Cemetery, she was no longer the ghost who haunted the nightmares of corrupt soldiers. She was something new, a teacher, a protector, and a guardian of the oath that every soldier swears to uphold. Her friends were avenged. Her war was won. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint echo of Marcus Chen's voice, not calling for revenge, but whispering words of forgiveness and hope. The angel of death had come home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.